What's up, everybody? It's your boy, Brandon, back with another edition of the Macro Insights podcast. But first, before we get started, a little disclaimer. I am not a financial advisor, and the guest is not giving financial advice. So everything you hear on this podcast is strictly opinion and should not be taken as financial advice. We disclose if we have any holdings discussed in this podcast, and you should not be following us as financial advisors. You should discuss this with professionals before you get involved or invested. And as always, it's not financial advice. So please, please, please take this strictly as our opinions and for entertainment purposes only. Now let's get into the show. What's up, everybody? I'm back with another edition of the Macro Insights podcast. But first, I'd like to thank my sponsor, Inverse. Inverse is a social and collaborative investment research platform. Many new companies like Robinhood have increased the access to financial markets. Well, Inverse is increasing the access to high-quality investment research and discussion. The entire platform is built around top-notch data and tools to help you analyze over 10,000 stocks and ETFs seamlessly. Is all embedded into the platform. And in the coming weeks, you'll be able to link your brokerage account, share your portfolio to maximize that credibility when you're writing about those various stocks and ETFs and presenting your theses, both bullish and bearish. And also, it'll allow you access to clean your portfolio with their various analytics tools. I myself have been using Inverse for quite some time now, and I absolutely love it. So come join me and follow me on Inverse at Green Candle IT and join the Green Candle Investments group there. And we can interact, post your ideas and podcasts and what have you there. And we can all have a nice discussion around the financial markets. Now, let's get into the episode. All right, I am back with another edition of the Macro Insights podcast, and I got a very special guest, Peter, or is it, how do you, Pyotr, or I'm sure. I probably should have asked you pre-show, but he's a very special guest. He's the host of the Global Gambit podcast, and he's been in and around the Tuesday night spaces. So, Peter, how you doing today?
I'm doing all right. Glad to be here.
Yeah, so you gotta clear it up for me. How do I pronounce your name correctly so I don't mess it up throughout the interview?
That's fine. We're probably going to go into some of the reasons behind that. It's Pyotr. So it's
Okay.
The thing I say to friends is sort of think of a peeing otter. So Pyotr, P-otter. I know it's a bit of a weird sound, but it seems to resonate and remember in the minds of people. So yeah,
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, thanks for being a good sport about it. And now let's get it rolling. Let's get into your background. So you have, you speak very eloquently when you come on the spaces about, what's going on about the, whole geopolitical climate and everything like that. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and, kind of how you got here today?
Yeah, it's I appreciate that compliment already. You haven't heard me after a whiskey or two, but I think that my personal background I think plays a lot into my interests in geopolitics more broadly. I was born because of the Soviet Union basically collapsing, which enabled my father to come and be with my mum. I don't want to bore your listeners to the whole story of how my parents met, but it is sort of very romantic and black and white film-esque and sort of rather circumstantial. So the broader sort of geopolitical events of that, my parents meeting in Russia in the 1980s, and then the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union in 1990, 89, sort of allowed my father to move, and he came with nothing. And so eventually my parents sort of settled down together in a part of southern England. And my mother, this is always something I found quite amusing. My mother was an artist in London, single mum, and she bought my father's first car for him, which was a Lada, 1950 something Lada. And my father's reaction is sort of like, well, I left Russia to get away from that, not to sort of have it back. Yeah, I was born in 93 and we grew up in southern England. It was pretty, I don't know, I would say stereotypical, but it isn't. My father was trying to make his way in the world in what was a very new world of former Soviet states, and, you know, be I wouldn't say opportunistic because it makes it sound negative, but yeah, seek his opportunity to try and make his own successes. And by the end of the 90s, he'd landed a senior position in a company called Beamer Gold. And by the turn of the millennia, he'd been pushed by people like a chap called Frank Juster and others to start his own companies. So he's been very heavily active in the natural commodity space. Which is sort of why I think I have an appreciation for that area business more broadly. It's not necessarily what I've been drawn to, but it was always something in the back of my mind. And then geopolitics sort of just, I don't know, I became really fascinated in the relationship of Russia to the West and how the whole world works sort of thing. We traveled a lot when I was a kid. The first place I ever went to was Kazakhstan at 6 months old, typical family holiday. I don't know, it just sort of stuck. So I've spent my, shall we say, later years studying international relations, geopolitics, particularly great power politics. I'm very interested in how in India, China, the United States, Russia, the EU now, I guess, sort of play together, globalization, and all how this impacts sort of the economics of the countries, the economy of the world. And yeah, it's sort of stuck. Now I'm here in DC the past 4 years working in a few different roles currently at the World Bank. So that's a whirlwind of my sort of background.
Yeah, and I mean it's great, and I think everybody kind of brings a, every guest that I have brings a unique background that kind of leads them almost to their expertise. But yours is definitely one of the more unique ones, to say the very least. And so, on that note, like, with everything kind of going on now, do you think that your background has kind of, I guess, played a role in how everybody, of course, has their biases and things like that. But, do you think like it's kind of helped you essentially become like, where you're at today and, in DC working for the World Bank? Do you think, your upbringing has brought you there? Or do you think, maybe at a certain point you had kind of an inclination for, working for a bank or something along those lines?
I work for the World Bank because it more focuses on development and poverty, not so much because it's finance orientated. I've always appreciated and found the importance of finance, but I did it because it's sort of a mixture of you're working in financial areas, but it's towards a good goal like sustainable development or something, which for me, I've traveled around a lot of the global south, and it's just something I've become really passionate about and appreciate. It's sort of particularly Africa. I've traveled around about 15 countries there, and I want to sort of ensure that everybody has an opportunity to feel the potential. And I do think that there's been a degree of, colonialism is still something that a lot of people are increasingly talking about. And my background personally, I mean, I don't know if you or your listeners have ever had one of those moments where it doesn't feel particularly consequential, but I just remember I was like 10, standing in my living room. My father had just got back from a trip and we were beginning to talk about, maybe I was 13, a bit older, but I would talk about like sort of advanced education. And my father being sort of, he's got a PhD in nuclear physics and thermonuclear dynamics specialization or something. He's a clever dude. And my mother's an artist. So they're the opposite ends of the educational spectrum. But I was just very interested in sort of geography and where we are and how it works. And he was like, well, maybe you should think about geopolitics. And that was the first time I'd ever heard that word. And it just sort of got stuck in my head. And then a few years later, we were looking at like, I don't know, it's 2008, 2009, I was beginning to look at colleges or universities. And I kept being drawn back to this thing called international relations. And my father was like, but what about economics or, corporate finance or, business, something related more business? And I was like, yeah, it's interesting, but I quite like this international relations thing. So over time, I've tried to sort of refine it because IR is very theoretical, quite conceptual, and you need to put it into applied circumstances. So that's why I did my master's at SAIS or Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, because their curriculum at the time, I think they've changed it now, is you have to do economics. And economics is a core component of any foreign policy, including things as arbitrary as macroeconomic trends. So you need to have a good understanding. I mean, you have to be some quantitative nut with econometrics capabilities, but I think it's a fundamental aspect, and we're seeing, you know, a shift in the international system, which I think we'll come to later. But one of those is a increasing rejection of the neoliberalism economics order that has predicated or dominated the international system since the 1980s, particularly Reaganomics, Thatcherism, all this sort of stuff. So over time, I've tried to diversify and look at things like behavioral economics, development economics, looking further forward as well, because it's not just a case of doing things that are needed now, but what is going to be needed. And the thing I find rather ironic or weird is that I seem to be ahead of the curve sometimes. I've applied to positions in the past where, you know, it's to do with communications or engagement with stakeholders, and I have a background in international relations, which diplomacy you'd think is a natural element to that. And I've had rejections with people going, "Oh, sorry, you don't have a, you know, degree in communications." People have. I think it's this lack of intersectionality, this lack of versatility and crossover, overlap between disciplines, which is part of the problem, and where I've tried to position myself. But I think we're getting there slowly. But yeah, so you know, we're all evolving every day, and you know, I learn so much from your spaces and your viewers or your listeners who contribute to those. I mainly just, because frankly, I'm out of my depth with the intricate market explanations or discussion. But yeah, so that's sort of where I am.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, I think, like, you know, like you said, like macro and like what's going on geopolitically, granted, like maybe it's not the best to trade or you know, invest based on those trends, but I think like there's a lot of it that affects the market and, you know, globally as well too. So, you know, on that note, I've kind of seen like maybe a recent trend, you know, not a recent trend, but a trend that, you know, countries have kind of moved a little bit more to, you know, a global economy, more globalism. And it seems like, you know, what's going on right now in Russia and Ukraine, and, you know, maybe the potential like energy crisis. I don't know if you want to kind of get into that. In Germany and some of these other European countries have kind of, I guess, almost made policyholders seem to second guess that and kind of move towards, you know, local or nationalism, where they're kind of, you know, maybe going to start to trend the other direction. So, you know, how do you view, I guess, the overall macro environment in that aspect? Do you see us kind of moving towards that way? Or do you see, you know, maybe a continued rise of globalism, and this just might be like a little, I guess, hitch in the road?
Yeah, it's, you know, it's a very broad and I would say multi-layered question. I sort of would split in the way you framed it into three different areas. And the one thing I would say is that a lot of people like to speak to things that they don't have a expertise in to do so. And I prefer to just admit when I don't know something. So on the energy aspect, for example, I have limited knowledge. I don't have a explicit in-depth knowledge of energy markets. I appreciate it, and I followed obviously what's going on with the pipeline Nord Stream, but I'm more about the sort of the country's relations and the very macro. But just to your point, I mean, just a bit of historical context. You know, there's debate over whether globalization or globalism, as it stands, is really the first time. The term itself came out in the 1980s, but we've seen arguably 3 or 4 waves of globalization. An example of one being in the run up to the First World War. And the boat race, the ships race, the naval race between the British and the Germans. And then there was a second wave between arguably 1918 and 1939, when you left the gold standard, and a shift in the general sort of beginning to see a shift in the currencies, and the predominant currency shifting from the pound to the dollar. So there has been a few examples. Some people even say mercantilism from the Middle Ages, when we were doing our, you know, exploring the New World, so to speak, was a form of globalism. But the one we're in is definitely the most obvious and the most nuanced. And I think broadly it has a large amount to do with the multipolarity or quantity of powers that are in the states. So, you know, up until 1990, we were in a bipolar world. Now we've been up until around, I would say, 2008, when the cracks really began to show, you know, an undisputed primacy of the United States. And then from 2008, that's when the United States dominance over the international financial system, but also just overall, was beginning to wane. most people call the United States a great power. It's more than that. It's a hyperpower because it had undisputed, unrivaled power across every single major element of power dynamics. So political, social, economic, cultural. China is an economics great power, superpower, but it doesn't have the sheer, coverage that the United States has done. So from 2008, I mean, and again, don't take 2008 as like one date and then suddenly everything's changing, but it's an inflection point. And I think that globalization has seen a significant growth in resistance in the past 10 years. Deglobalization has developed. Populism is a subset of that, or nationalism. These two things happen as a byproduct in some ways because of globalization. People felt that neoliberal economics was not giving them the dividends that they had been promised. It's what led to the eventual things like Brexit and Trump, because people were fed up with the system, fed up with establishment, fed up with the status quo, and wanted to see alternatives. So, but that being said, we do have a sort of a continued reliance on the system. China doesn't support Russia, for example, in Ukraine, because it knows it will benefit far more from keeping the United States and the West, which accounts for about 50% of GDP at the moment, than one reckless power, which is, struggling to figure out itself in the world, led by a despotic narcissist. So I think, we're in a phase of toing and froing. And I think the relationship of globalization and how much we want to engage with it will depend on what type of international order we see coming out of these major developments. We have seen a global pandemic, which has had ramifications, undoing, in the World Bank's estimations, for example, 25 years worth of international development, particularly in Africa. So, and then to your question about the rise of it was an interesting point I listened to in Bremer, who's arguably the creator of modern political risk and Eurasia Group, which is up until now, most analysis has focused on countries, specifically just country profiles, country risks. And what we lack is a proper integrated discipline or approach to genuine geopolitical risk. There's a weird anomaly here in that markets talk about geopolitical risk. Cambridge even has a global risk index, of which geopolitics has been the #1 issue for the past couple of years. But we don't see the two being actually academically or properly analyzed together. So what impact does geopolitical risk actually have on the markets? And that's what you're beginning to see shift, I think, when we talk about, like your space is the macro, the very macro, and how it all blends into one another. So sorry for that smorgasbord of different points, but I think it sort of comes to where we are now, which is really, really redefining time, I think, this period, early 20s.
Yeah, and I think like a big part of that is, probably because of the reset, right, that we've seen with the COVID, pandemic and everything like that as well. Like you said, the global economy shutting off for, I don't know, a varied time, depending on where you were and, however you view that, that whole scenario. But, now we kind of have the other risk that you talked about with the Russia invading Ukraine and how China isn't really backing them. I'd like you to kind of, I guess, go into, a little bit deeper into that, because, obviously I'm not an expert in geopolitics or anything like that, but it almost seems like now, as somebody, in the United States, that seems like it's like Russia and China and maybe some of these BRICS countries kind of working against the United States. And, the United States has kind of shown some weakness overall in the past few years, whether it was the way we left Afghanistan. Obviously now, with the global economy and everything like that, kind of wearing with the US dollar at the forefront, although the US dollar is kind of ripping compared to other fiat currencies. And, maybe that's a whole nother rabbit hole we could get it down into eventually as well. But so I guess back to my original question was, can you kind of go into a little bit deeper on how, China is viewing, I guess, this Russia invasion in the Ukraine?
Yeah. So there's a couple of points that I also want to mention after your main question, but the Chinese element is extremely nuanced. Up until this point, it's what you call the triaxis, basically. The three main powers that most geopolitical international relations analysts talk about in great power politics, which is Russia, China, and America. Now, I think India should be increasingly in there, and also non-state actors like the EU, for example. And China's relationship with America is, I would put it this way, which is that a lot of people talk about, are we entering a new Cold War? Are we entering some new, power dynamics of China on one side and America on the other, and they're the leaders of these two fronts? I don't think so, mainly because China is inherently different to the Soviet Union. They're much more of an economic force, much more coherent and cohesive than the Soviet Union ever was. And just an economic powerhouse. I mean, China has got its issues, which we can maybe unpack if you want. But, China doesn't want to replace the United States as the hegemon. It simply wants to level the playing field a little bit more, which is why you see them counterbalancing against the United States with the Russians, particularly. The Russians and the Chinese have a obviously complex history whereby the Chinese were the junior partner when the Soviet Union was still around. And now that position has completely flipped. And you were on the verge of potential vassalization of Russia to China, which is China becoming a vassal state to China. I don't think it's ever going to fully become to that extent. It just doesn't seem to me in my mind that the Russians would ever be okay with being sort of literally the sort of, sidekick to the Chinese. But China looks at this situation. I would say that China doesn't like what Russia is doing, but it equally doesn't like the United States legacy. If you talk to a lot of people and their discontent with the West, it often comes along the similar lines of a degree of arrogancy, hubris, hypocrisy. And I, for one, can appreciate that. Doesn't necessarily mean I like the countries. As soon as you say that, it's funny how often I'll be labeled a Russian apologist or Chinese apologist. It's like, not really. I live in the United States and have been studying and am heavily Western. I love democracy and rule of law and everything that their freedoms that provide us, but that doesn't mean I don't think that they have a point. A friend of mine probably said it best, I'm fed up of America being the global policeman, sort of assuming that every country will conform to its norms and values and introduce a democratic societal system. China wants to govern the way it wants to govern. Russia wants to be governing the way it wants to govern. The problem with Russia is when they start doing things in other countries which are subjugating or oppressing, that is completely out of line, and we are doing the right thing by standing up to what Russia is doing in Ukraine. But at the same time, so China and Russia and their main alliance or partnership is one of mutual resentment or frustration or impatience with the West. But that's not a big way to build a long-term friendship, right? The two aren't friends. The United States and the UK or France have an alliance. They have a joint declaration of committed support to one another, whilst China and Russia don't. They have just a mutual set of interests which are predominantly self-motivated. And that's not a long-term pathway. So if the West was more intelligent or tactful, it would have kept Russia on side instead of alienating it, I think, in the early 2000s, for example. Russia certainly didn't help itself when it invaded Georgia by any chance of that, and then, annexing Crimea and all this sort of stuff. But I do think the West has a role to play in that. And I think we should also collectively be wary of referring to the West as a monolith. So generally, I think China looks at this war as one of, it's probably overall against it. It understands Russia's perspective, which it's made clear in its statements, but it also makes clear that it understands countries' right for sovereignty and territorial integrity, which Ukraine is having to fight for, and the war is unjustifiable. But China looks at things much longer term than Russians do, or at least this Kremlin regime does. There was a good podcast I listened to, and it summarized Russia as being a revanchist power, wanting to reform its territorial size and coverage, whilst China is a revisionist. China wants to revise its history and historical associations with certain countries or entities or communities, like specifically Taiwan. So, and China's much further forward-looking than Russia, much longer term. Russia is a reckless toddler throwing its toys out the pram, huffing and puffing, whilst China is there in the background thinking not years or months, but decades ahead from now, which is why the CCP is such a threat. because they really are, planning the reincorporation of Taiwan, Hong Kong, all these things with such finite detail. So China is not happy with what Russia's doing, but and I think if the war continues to destabilize the global markets, to bring back that element in, China will increasingly distance itself from Russia, because at the end of the day, as I say, China has grossly benefited from this economy than getting into bed with Russia. Because what does Russia have to offer before even Ukraine? Not much. Lots of energy, but now it's being completely cut off, and China needs to get more on the non-renewables as well. So, and just to your point about the BRICS are a bunch of countries that aren't actually that anything. It was mainly a term developed by Goldman Sachs to define these, what were thought to be the main emerging economies of the 2000s or 21st century. And 3 of them have amounted to nothing. Brazil, well, not nothing, but Brazil, South Africa and Russia have waned or seen a lot of internal issues, whilst China and India really are the two to follow and will be the main economic powerhouses along with the US in the next foreseeable future, and the EU if you count that.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, that's great stuff. And so I mean, that covers why China doesn't really, I guess, see the way with Russia going forward. But there's also been rumblings of China potentially invading Taiwan, and you kind of touched on some of their revisionist goals of sort of like revising history and everything like that. So, what, I guess, benefits would China see from invading Taiwan? And, what are, I guess, are some of the potential reactions that you could, maybe see from, some other countries if China were to kind of go through with it and invade Taiwan? Because it seems like the U.S. is already trying to put some sanctions on them. And, there's been some rumblings of some other things as well. So, what overall are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's, big question. Need an entire podcast just for it. But I would say there's a lot of understandable connections between the two major forces dealing with a smaller entity and the potential to forcibly reunite it or incorporate it or unify it into this sort of imperialistic or whatever kind of entity, right? Driven largely through ideology, historical, cultural connection. But they are very different purely from the pragmatic and military aspect. One is a land invasion with what we thought was the second most powerful military in the world, what is actually a laughingstock, versus a navy, or the People's Liberation Army, or PLA of China, which we've never seen in action, for one, which is quite important, and also has a guaranteed support by the United States to come to its defense versus Ukraine. So the conflict, if there were to be a conflict between China and Taiwan, which I might just add as a caveat, there is not 100% guaranteed it will. Some people think that the Chinese deliberately use Taiwan as a way to foster nationalism. So whenever they have a domestic degree of challenges, they drum up nationalistic sentiment by saying, well, don't forget we're going to invade Taiwan, and the great national rejuvenation, as it's known, will be reestablished, and the glory days of the Chinese dynasties will come back, sort of thing, which is an interesting take. I still am very conscious that President Xi Jinping wants to cement himself in Chinese glory and history, along the same lines as Mao Zedong. So it could well happen, and that would mean a maritime amphibious invasion, which would be, I think, far more escalatory than the Ukrainian one, because you have a commitment of a large array of forces down there. The Japanese, who have the 3rd largest navy in the world, South Korea, which is expanding its maritime capabilities, the Australians, who have now shifted away from being friendly with China or cordial to now just being completely in the US Western camp of give us nuclear capable or powered subs. We want to be able to help defend the South China Sea and the Indo-Pacific. The British are down there, the French are down there, and then obviously the Americans. And historically, for your listeners, there was an interesting sort of assessment done in 1944 by the Americans called Operation Causeway, which was basically to see what it would take to undertake some kind of invasion or landing onto Taiwan. And it was like double the size of D-Day, 400,000 men, 4,000 maritime vessels, we're talking big stuff, right? Russia sent in about 190,000 thereabouts, we don't fully know, into Ukraine. And this is going up a mass against the standing army of the Chinese, which is like over 1 million or something. I don't fully know the reserve. It's ridiculous. So this conflict would be massive. It remains to be seen whether or not the Chinese would directly engage, or what the Taiwanese would do. And it's all about the biggest way to distinguish it is there's a difference between taking Taiwan and keeping it. Taiwan has a amazing terrain in terms of mountains, weather, which would be, the topography is basically perfect for guerrilla warfare. So there's sort of, people fighting using the terrain around them to hide and under a bit like the Cubans did against the Americans, or the Spanish in the Civil War sort of thing. There's so many elements to it that would make it more difficult to assess. So from a global markets point of view, I would say that, again, what I understood was, doing a bit of research about Ukraine, is, again, there's not an easy way to measure geopolitical risk in a quantitative sense, because a lot of geopolitical risk is driven through normative reasons, or sometimes it can be pragmatic. But how do you still quantify that? How do you put that in? Do you add an index? You add a data point? Like, how do you do that? So there was an interesting study that I came across, and it was talking about how one study literally measured the impacts based on distance from the epizone of the conflict. So let's use Ukraine and Russia as a case in point. You measure the ramifications or reverberations of that war or conflict, or whatever it is, across the different markets subsequently. So look at the SP or the NASDAQ or FTSE, and depending upon how much the volatility that occurs within them, you can measure sort of to what extent they were impacted. For example, European stock prices tanked far more than those across further afield in other parts of the world. So basically, equity markets are priced in a negative geopolitical risk premium, is what I'm trying to say. So, but the other element to that is also just considering this in the broader picture of global north versus global south. So whilst the European markets tanked in Ukraine quickest, they recovered also the most, and shows you the resiliency and the importance of European markets still to the global economy. Whilst other parts of the globe, like for the Middle East, for example, they tanked quite quickly as well, because they're still quite close to Ukraine, but they've struggled to recover. It's been very imbalanced there, because also a lot of the countries there are energy-led economies, like Saudi Arabia, so they are going to feel that. Now, we've seen the OPEC plus countries sort of band together, and it's stabilized since, but there's also the food crisis in the Middle East, which is not something the Europeans are having to deal with. So it depends. There's so many elements that are regional, and then that's not even introducing climate risk. Climate risk on top of geopolitical risk. I know it sounds like some of your listeners are going, "Oh God, he's talking about climate change already," but it is an element, because if you already live in a hot area of the world and you see your temperatures increasing or just sustainably higher, that's going to exacerbate the geopolitical instabilities that are being created by these human-induced conflicts. So to bring this into this situation of Taiwan is, there are a few developed economies like South Korea, Japan, Taiwan itself, Singapore, but there's also a lot of EMEs, emerging economies, which are very important to global growth and markets, but would tank and not necessarily have the resiliency to bounce back very quickly. I'm thinking sort of Indonesia or Malaysia or Vietnam. Right, these are countries which are important for certain goods productions, like the Vietnamese-US trade, for example, via the US Chamber of Commerce. They've been going up as America has been decoupling from China. The other Southeastern Asian states, which have very, very, very productive economies, particularly Vietnam, are growing. So if you have a war in the South China Sea, what impact is that going to have on those local economies, which will then have a subsequent impact on the US and its markets? So the South China Sea is somewhere that I'm even more worried about because of just the disjointedness. It's far less integrated. The EU has whether or not you like it, it does have a stabilizing force about it. You have central institutions which can help with that. Whilst in South China, Southern Eastern Asia, you don't. There's no ECB equivalent. You have ASEAN, but it's a useless organization, frankly. So sorry for that long-winded talk, but I am, very concerned by Taiwan and the South China Sea.
Yeah, and I mean, it seems like a lot of issues are going on, just over in Europe, just from effects of what's already going on in Russia and Ukraine. So you kind of touched on it slightly, but how would this invasion on Taiwan and that kind of war, and it seems like although the Russia-Ukraine has been kind of a like you described a smaller one, 190,000 troops have entered Ukraine that we know of. So what would happen, I guess, in Europe as the proximity and everything else, like kind of the reliance on China over there, would that kind of continue down the path of hurting Europe drastically? Because it seems like there's massive amounts of inflation, and a bunch of other issues, obviously the energy crisis and things like that too going on in Europe. So it seems like another war that would be kind of close in proximity and close in, just the overall global economy would kind of be pretty detrimental to a lot of countries in the EU. Do you kind of see it affecting that way? Or do you see, I guess, Europe kind of finding a way to prevail, and this, potential of a China-Taiwan conflict wouldn't affect them too much?
I will premise my point by saying I don't think that the Chinese-Taiwanese conflict is going to happen in any time soon. I mean, it depends, and this is another thing. Geopolitical time horizons can be very different to market time horizons. Politics and economics are very different timescales. If we take another risk like climate change, for example, there is an inherent problem with trying to deal with an overarching issue like climate change when in the West, average election cycles last no more than 4 to 5 years, or in the United States, midterms, which have a potential to significantly change the political landscape, 2 years. So you were trying to undertake effective policy and substantive, like actual physical change to infrastructure, economics, so on, in a political climate which is completely against it. So that is a problem. And there isn't an easy answer for that. That's why one of the main debates you see these days, and I'll get onto your question, is what governance model is best? One that is more authoritative and therefore controls the economy, but therefore means greater economic stability, or one where you have greater freedoms, political choice, democracy, i.e., or a freer version of democracy, but you get more economic instability, volatility, business cycle booms, busts, and so on, because of this continuous potential shift in ideology, approach to policies, and so on. That's why, take Britain, for example. There's been so lack of investment in supply-side policies in the past 10 years, even more, because every bunch of party morons are thinking about the next election. Like Liz Truss has tried to achieve supply-side growth through deficit, through demand-side stimuli, cutting taxes to increase long-term. What? Anyway, so to your question, I don't think that China and Taiwan are going to happen soon. President Xi is up for his re-election, in quotation marks, in about a month, less, 3 weeks. It's not. It's just them ticking boxes to say he's going to, and now he can run the party as long as he likes. And again, I think he will try to reincorporate Taiwan into the mainland. But I think it would be absolutely madness and illogical, irrational for the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, to undertake some operation whilst Russia is doing what it's doing in Ukraine. The Chinese want to see, and again, not because they're going to take tips from Russia what to not do and to do via military tactics, but simply just for its ramifications from the West, what happens, right? If China were to, and this builds on from your previous question as well, had China done a little bit more than simply strongly worded statements with the Russians, like actually provide them economic support, military gear, they would have been sanctioned, secondary sanctions, which the Chinese don't want because they gain 2% of their trade from Russia versus 40% or whatever ridiculous number it is for the collective West, right? So the Chinese aren't going to jeopardize all that by trying to support Russia in a vendetta that they, frankly, excuse me, don't care about. They don't have any interest in Ukraine. I mean, historically, what significance does it have to them? Nothing. So, and I mean that with the biggest amount of respect to my Ukrainian friends, because what is happening is abhorrent. But just purely from a very realpolitik standpoint, which is how the Chinese approach geopolitics, they're not going to sacrifice or risk all that. So they're going to wait to see how the West responds. And there's 2 points to this, which is one, the Americans actually told the Chinese what Russia was doing and the likelihood of them actually invading all the way early back in December, January. The Chinese rejected it, thinking it was the Americans trying to do a ploy. And well, here we are. So the Chinese have actually been quite muted on this, I think, because they are questioning, the ill intention of the West, so to speak, at least in a very broad sense. And secondly, because no one, I think, at least on the Russian side and their supporters, not allies, expected such a collectively united and strong response from the West. The sanctions may be flawed, the West may be suffering, but Russia is going to keel over from this sanctions program and what it is experiencing from the West in terms of losing visas, assets being frozen, what's happened to the and all of that it shows you the capacity for the West to get shit done when it needs to, and this is what they should have done 8 years ago in 2014, the annexation of Crimea. So China, I think, is probably looking at that and thinking, oh, that's more than we anticipated. So I think they're reviewing and reflecting and will maybe make moves, but I don't think it will happen for a long time, at least several years. So I don't think the markets need to worry about it. But what I think would be better is, instead of us reacting to stuff, is to preemptively do something about it. Try and deter, although deterrence as a grand strategy doesn't always work, but try and engage China in a way that, they don't feel the need to invade Taiwan or do something. Try and maintain the status quo. But, it's very difficult for us as a Western collective to say to China what it should and shouldn't do with an island that it thinks is inherently its own and historical associations. So. Sorry for a long-winded answer, but it's not an easy thing to.
No, exactly. And a lot of this stuff is not easy. That's why, I wanted to come and bring you on and discuss some of these things too. But, you mentioned sanctions, and that's been kind of a big topic of discussion when it comes to a lot of these, I guess, macro discussions around energy and other things like that too. So, when it comes to oil and all that, but I'm asking more of like a general general question is like, how effective can a lot of these sanctions be, right? Because if there's a dire need for something, whether it's oil or energy or food or something along these lines, like, if the U.S. places a sanction on, for example, they're in talks of potentially putting a sanction on Iranian oil. So, if they place that sanction and somebody else kind of goes against, that said sanction and makes a deal with Iran, I guess, are countries more like, afraid of, maybe upsetting the United States and going around that? Or, is it kind of, almost like every man for themselves, and these sanctions are just a lot of like hubbub and people just kind of, or politicians just kind of politicking?
Yeah, no, it's a broad question again, and I want to remind listeners, at this point, I've said some things, you may not agree with it, or I'm missing some things out. There's only so much space in my brain, so don't hold everything I say as gospel. We all need to always read and learn more. But to your question, I think that sanctions are. People ask me, do you think sanctions work or not? And I'm really on the fence, because it depends. There's so many caveats. There's so many right. It's like, oh, does it? What pisses me off the most? Sorry, it's a rant for a second. Is people try and make geopolitics black and white. Can I swear on this show? It's fucking not. They're fucking not. Stop making geopolitics black and white. It's called grey warfare for a reason, people. It's called grey zone because everything is so nuanced, right? So anyway, sorry, rant over. Hi, everyone. Sanctions do work, but it depends on what your objective is and what time frame or what, how you're referring them to, right? So it's a bit like the war, right? Russian apologists will say, oh, no, Ukraine's not winning. Well, no one's winning. It's a war. Everyone's yes, of course no one's fucking winning. But the point is the Ukrainians are closer to their military objectives than the Russians are. The Russians wanted to take over Ukraine and install a regime change, right? Change of government, get Zelensky out of there. Well, no, they're nowhere near fucking that. They can't even keep the places that they're now claiming up breaking away, i.e. the oblasts. Ukraine, on the other hand, is much closer to military objectives, which the grand ones being to reclaim the land that is rightfully theirs and kick the Russians out and finally, hopefully, render them incapable of attacking Ukraine again. So when we're talking about sanctions, you need to judge them by which the objectives that they were set. So if the sanctions for Iran are regime change, well, they've categorically failed, yes. But sanctions do work in inducing behavioral change. And that's one of the most important things I want to underline in this section of the discussion, because there are different types of sanctions. Sanctions can be both punitive, but also incentive, in the sense of we will roll back certain sanctions if you do X, Y, and Z. I know it sounds inverse, but sort of, or perverse, but that's sort of what I mean. So, for example, with the Iranian ones, Iran was, before Russia was sanctioned this year, the most sanctioned country in the world. Before the deal was finalized, I thought it was a good idea to see what the JCPOA or the Iranian nuclear deal could achieve. Not enough time was given to see what impact it could have before the Trump administration came back and rolled back their agreement and imposed maximum pressure, i.e. lots of sanctions, which was a bad idea, I think. We should have given it a few more years, but now we're in this situation where Iran is protesting. My heart goes out in full solidarity with the Iranian people. We must never conflate a regime with the people, and the sanctions have crippled the Iranian economy. For example, in 2011 and 12, when the SWIFT sanctions were imposed, much lighter versions than the ones we've seen on Russia. The SWIFTs being the predominant, that system used to conduct payments, was a fraction of the Russian one, but it cut the Iranian output of oil, I think it was, by half in less than a year, and incentivized them or coerced them or whatever, come to the table to begin the discussions for the JCPOA in the first place. So sanctions do work. Another example historically is Liberia in 2002. 1996 to 2000, early 2000s, there was a massive civil war in Liberia and Western Africa where, tens of thousands of people died. And sanctions were used, and this is another point I want to emphasize, which is sanctions are but one tool in a toolbox of economic statecraft. And they were used as part of a multitude of other methods by which to incentivize over 100,000 fighters, mercenaries, whatever you want to call it, to put down their guns and end the conflict in some estimates, 5-10 years early. So the sanctions did work in Liberia. You could argue that the sanctions in the UN against Yugoslavia did work to an extent. Did they stop the war entirely? No, of course they didn't. But it was in combination with that, NATO forces, UN peacekeepers, and all of this is not perfect. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that intervention is always best, but when you're dealing with a war that is terrible, how does anyone respond? We saw the impact that doing nothing had in Rwanda in 1994, right? A genocide of over 1 million people in less than 3 months. So, it's a difficult one. And I'm not saying I have all the answers. No one has all the answers. But sanctions, if done correctly, can be impactful, and they brought the Bosnian wars to a close much sooner because the Daytona Agreement of 1995 was achieved much sooner. The sanctions against Russia are going to, I don't even really want to envisage what the Russian economy is going to look like after these sanctions. You're losing an entire generation of Russians through, fighting in the war, but also fleeing the country. And Russia's got a demographic issue as it is. It's declining, it's aging. And what does Russia as an economy actually have to offer the world aside from non-renewables like gas and oil, natural commodities? Not much. They've got an impressive advanced tech industry, but that's been crippled, and the military industrial complex is gone because of the sanctions against their tanks and shit. So what does Russia have to offer? So the sanctions are very... they used to be much more broad and crude, embargoes, dumb sanctions. Now they're smart sanctions or targeted sanctions, financial sanctions, and they are getting better. So I would say, when we talk about sanctions, we've got to be specific about what we're talking about, who they're applied to, who's imposing them. Is there a consistent coordination between all actors relevant to the matter? So another fact before I pass back to you is one of the issues with, or two facts actually. One is that there's poor coordination between certain states with sanctions. So Russia is still able to sustain this war because China is buying oil or energy from Russia and then selling it back to other markets. And it's buying that energy from Russia at a discounted price and then racking it up to original or whatever to sell on the overall market. Now, I don't know if we're going to sanction China over that, but that's besides the point. It is basically, countries aren't, the whole world isn't sanctioning Russia, which means Russia's still going to be able to get away with certain things because there's gaps, there's loopholes. The other thing is the sanctions that the West have imposed haven't been consistent. So only certain Russian banks, like Severn Bank or Rosneft or Gazprom, some three of the main ones in Russia, some countries have imposed sanctions on them, but not others. And also other major banks in Russia haven't been sanctioned. So basically what happens is Gazprom just goes to the non-sanctioned bank in Russia and says, hey, can you send this money out or do whatever it is with the European markets and get those, get that financial exchanges happening. And because they don't have the sanctions, they can do it. And then so they just work around, instead of just going straight across, they go down one and then up, through another intermediary. So it's just really dumb. And then the last thing I would say is on this whole idea of an alternative financial model, I had an interview with on the Global Gambit podcast with a fellow from the Council on Foreign Relations about the political economy of Russia and China and their capacity to build an alternative financial system. Now, the currency of China is nowhere near the reserve currency of the United States. The US still accounts for about 58%. It's teetered between 55, 65% since the late 90s, I think. And the euro accounts for about 20, and then you've got the yuan and the pound or whatever. But the Chinese currency, I always forget the name, what it's called, less than 2%. Russia's the ruble. Are you kidding? I wouldn't wipe my ass with it. So you know what I mean? This whole idea that they would create some alternative financial model. Well, yeah, they could, but not for many years. And the SWIFT system, payment system, there was an interesting article from Bloomberg back in March talking about, the level that the Chinese alternative is called CIPS or CIPS. And they, at the time of writing, they were doing about 13,000 transactions a day. SWIFT is like 3-4 million. Like it's not there yet. So, the alternative is maybe non-fiat currencies. But, not many countries have a lot of faith in that. Only El Salvador has done that. So making it legal tender, you can do, but there's going to be a lot of risks that come with crypto. I'm not against crypto, don't get me wrong. I'm just I think it needs to be regulated a little bit more. But anyway, that's a separate topic. So we can, I'll pass back to you because I know I'm whittering on too much.
No, that's great. And it's interesting that you brought that up yourself, on that, because I did kind of mention that earlier. So I'll wrap it up with this one last question that might be a little broad, so feel free to jump around and bounce around on that. But I mean, it's more on, I guess like the role that the Fed is playing on the global economy, right? It seems like everybody is kind of waiting on the words of Jerome Powell, whether the United States is going to raise rates, cut rates, pull back, all this and that. And it seems like, he has, immense amount of power because the U.S. has the global reserve currency right now. And it seems like a lot of people or a lot of countries want to get out from that. You mentioned El Salvador, and there's a lot of other issues going on and massive amounts of inflation going on globally, not only in the United States, but in Europe. It seems like it's getting even worse. England just announced that they're going to be doing a seemingly endless QE to buy back governmental bonds. So, I mean, on that note, do you think that there's going to be, maybe a potential, fall of many of these fiat currencies and, on moving towards that, or maybe the U.S. getting away from the U.S. as the global reserve currency, or the dollar as the global reserve currency?
I'll premise by saying this is probably the area that I will be most vague about, because it's not something it's difficult to, I'm not a financial analyst. And this is the point. I do geopolitics, but there's a lack of, I think that's reflected in myself. I need to go more and read about the relationship between the two. But I would say that, and this is where I sort of would think of my dad again a little bit and his experience with sort of natural commodities. You know, a colleague of his called Frank Giustra, who some of your listeners may know, he talks about, he's not, I think, in favor of crypto. And there's a lot of divergence amongst investors, big scale investors, about whether or not crypto is the new form of mainstream currency, or whether it's going to usurp currencies like the United States. You know, I've not actually gotten into crypto very much. I have a bit, but not much, relative to sort of other people who I'm probably, of anyone you've interviewed on this series, I'm by far the least probably. But you know, it fascinates me and I watch it with very big interest. You know, Frank and others sort of talk about, or people on that side of the fence sort of talk about, you know, not foregoing traditional things like gold. And I do resonate with that. I do think that you know, Web3 is still very much in its early stages, and I think it would be unwise to put all one's eggs in one basket. Not that you would, I think, as a responsible investor, but I think you know, sure, you want to be ahead of the curve, but also I think it's sometimes so that it depends who your audience is, or it depends who you're talking to. If it's someone who is a risk taker and like those high risk, high reward sort of things, then go for it. But if you have the capital to do that, but if you don't and you're starting out or you're not sure, then I wouldn't encourage people to do that. I know this isn't investment advice. I feel I should say that. But, you know, let's think about it very, very, let's take what we know at the moment, right? In real time, current events past even week. The events in the UK are self-inflicted. They are a bunch of uneducated, at least in economics, out of their depth politicians who are being driven by short-termist, self-interested gains than they are the long-term welfare of not just the most impoverished people, those relying on their pensions or anything like that, but just the sheer aggregate economy. What is happening in the United Kingdom, which is one of the first countries, if not the first, I think, to separate its central bank from the government in the 90s, is not, you know, is no one in their right mind would do that. The only other country I can think where they're going in the face of traditional economic policy is Erdogan in Turkey. And using your listeners, if they're interested, look up Erdonomics. It's hilarious, right? He's doing the opposite of what every quintessential economic theory states. Really funny. That's why you've got inflation in Turkey of what, 100 million something. But anyway, so the UK, I think, is isolated. I wouldn't read too much into that affecting global commodity or global markets. People will know what, you know, will be able to keep away from that, because if the UK is going to keep doing that to itself, it's mainly just going to affect the UK. The UK, just as a side, is, you know, reeling from Brexit and will for a long time. Not whether or not you voted for it, that's a separate matter. It's just, you know, the UK is finding itself. The symbolic loss of the Queen. The UK is really, you know, for those of your listeners who are interested in the UK markets, you know, the UK is in a tough place. I don't want to live in the UK at the moment. I don't want to be earning money in the pound. I want to be earning it in the dollar. And that leads me to my other point, which is, for what it's worth, the United States is still performing very well. It's the best performing of the G7 economies, I think, of all the economies that, you know, is suffering from the remnants of COVID, the global, you know, impacts of the Ukraine war, the energy crisis. US is doing well. Why is the dollar so strong? That's what I keep seeing in major news outlets. Why is the dollar performing so well? It remains the global reserve currency for a reason. And whilst the Europeans have to deal with the increased securitization on their borders from the war, which will mean the euro is more precarious, sure, Japan and their currency, the yen, is a possibility. Maybe the Indians' currency, I don't know, in the future. But like, there's not many currencies out there really that have the same global reach as the US dollar. And isn't, you know, sure, there's a lot of volatility. The polarization in America, your internal domestic political situation is very, very precarious. But relative to the economic turmoil of parts of Europe, the underdevelopment and non-existent economies of Africa, unfortunately, not to their own fault, Southeast Asia being plagued by, you know, regional hegemonic ambitions and instability from China. China's very inward, insular thing, meaning that their economy is not there. there's not any alternative that I can really see in terms of currency. So, you know, I think for the time being, and this goes back to my point about being a hyperpower, I do think the United States, yes, it's declining or it's plateauing and China's rising and all these buzzwords that people like to use. Yes, that is happening. But from purely an economic and financial standpoint, America is still very much in a solid position, not prime, but solid. And I think it would be wise to, you know, balance that along with looking at what happens with crypto. And just on the crypto fact, I'm not against it, as I say, I'm just wary of it. I'm wary of the fact from what I see, which is more of a geopolitical-esque, you know, more traditional, maybe I'm just a dinosaur, I don't know. But I look at the physical world as much as what's happening, you know, virtually. And the fact that we've only had one small Central American state under, and I would point out, a very left, you know, Latin America has a huge problem with going far left to far right, far left, far right. They're called pink and blue surges or waves in voting habits. Isn't great. And the leader, I forget his name, he did it as a way to try and win favor with some of his flailing electorate. And it hasn't gone that well. He bought loads more of Bitcoin, which made, you know, and then I don't know what Bitcoin is at now, but, you know, when it was at a high of whatever it was, and then it kept tanking and tanking at the beginning of the year. And the guy was like, no, let's buy more. Let's buy 4 more Bitcoins. What are you doing? Like, so, you know, there's a reason why you haven't seen it catch on. I think I might have read a couple of other states, but mainly very underdeveloped states following suit. But like, there's no major developed economy or advanced economy that is thinking, yes, we're going to focus on crypto. So until I see a responsible, maybe not advanced economy, but a responsible one, take, for example, I know Ghana. Ghana is a very politically stable and quite a gradually growing economy, or Kenya, right? In Africa. If those two countries begin to look at crypto as an alternative, then I will begin to pay more of attention. I know it's a very arbitrary example, but like, you know, Ghana relative to Sierra Leone or Burkina Faso or Mali, which are all suffering from internal political strife, Ghana is gradually growing. They're growing at a rate of, I think, 2-3% a year, 4%, which for an African country is pretty good. So, you know, until I see countries which are not necessarily America or something like that, then I will begin to feel like, yeah, more comfortable with getting in with it. And then the last thing I'll land on is the UN. The UN needs to be considered in all of this. Multilaterals need to be considered in all of this. The World Bank needs to be considered in all of this. And what role do they play, non-state actors play, in influencing markets, currencies, and so on? But anyway, maybe we can talk about that in another conversation in the future. So thank you very much.
Yeah, of course. So thank you so much for your time. You've been very generous. Why don't you tell everybody where they can find you and what all you got going on?
Sure. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure. You know, I have my own podcast, listeners. The Global Gambit, hosted by Pyotr Kurzin. You know, going into podcast mode. It's available on Apple, Spotify. Gambit is spelled Gambit. And the reason I called it Global Gambit is because Gambit means a risky move to outwit your opponent. And global gambit means, well, global. So, and the icon, if you look it up, type it incorrectly, is a globe with a chessboard superimposed on top of it. Because I was like, well, it's a global chessboard. People are playing stratagem with one another. So there's that. And the thing I would say to all your listeners is I record mine on sometimes on Twitter and on Clubhouse. Because I like the social dynamics. I like getting people to join in the conversation, ask questions, and make it what I've called a social podcast. So, 45 minutes of a traditional Q&A like this, and then 10 minutes of audience participation. So if they ever want to join in participation, then follow me on Twitter at Kurzin, Kurzin. And yeah, love to stay in touch with anyone who has any questions or anything. And my email is always open. It's theglobalgambit@gmail.com. But Perfect. Thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for coming on. And yeah, we'll have to get you back on eventually. And then, I'll probably jump into one of these recorded podcasts on your spaces and everything like that. That seems like a cool concept. So I'm excited to join that and get it going. So thank you so much for your time and look forward to connecting with you further.
Cheers, Ben. Thanks a lot, everyone.